Hello, and I'm so glad that you could join me on this Memorial Day. I am making this short video as a special way to say thank you to all of those who have made the ultimate sacrifice for our freedom, as a way to help you and your family remember why we hold this day sacred and separate from the rest of our year, and why it is a day of remembrance within our culture. And along with that, the poppy is a very special symbol for Memorial Day, and it's been one that in my family we have treasured. I remember always stopping to get poppies from the veterans at the grocery store, and my grandmother always wore poppies. We have made felt poppies, the girls and I, for Memorial Day, and this year I thought that I would share a little video about painting poppies for you to enjoy, and so that you can make this a practice within your family, and hopefully it will be helpful to you. So all you need is a little watercolor paint, any kind will do, some water, and a brush. I have a nice thirsty one here, and by that I mean that it has natural bristles and it's got a nice wide base here, and it can absorb a lot of paint and water, but any brush that you have ought to do. And we'll get started. This is a pretty simple tutorial. I'm hoping that it's appropriate for lots of different skill levels, so that, you know, if you are doing this with a wide range of skills, you know, you'll have a variety of outcomes, but everyone should still be able to get something out of it. So let's get a fresh sheet of paper and we'll get started. I'm going to begin with my brush and a little bit of water in the red paint. I'm just going to moisten that little cake of paint here and mix it up. Just a few dabs of water, a few dabs of pigment there. And my brush isn't terribly wet, but there's some paint in the bristles. And now I'm going to draw a little oval here, lightly with just the tip of my bristles, about like that. And this is the center of the poppy. And then I'm going to lightly outline a few pieces of the petal. So this is where I'm imagining the outside of the petal is, here and here. And then I'm going to draw a line there and here, radiating out from the center. I don't want these to be too straight. Those are actually a little bit more straight than I'd like, so I'm going to make sure this one has some curve to it. And then these up front, I want to be a good deal shorter because I'm imagining that they are coming forward rather than extending upward or back. And then once I have these lines that are sort of radiating out from this central oval shape, I'm going to take my brush and just dip the bottom third of the bristles in the water and wipe a little bit of the excess off so that the brush is damp but not sopping wet. And I'm going to wiggle the brush in between those lines like so, and sort of spread that pigment back and forth, and then let the top edge look a little ruffled like that. So if it's not getting a kind of wavy or ruffled look to the edge, then I'm going to go back and add a little more texture. And I want these petals to overlap a bit. I'm going from line to line. I don't want to go right over them because then I wouldn't have the slightly darker line there. Also, did you notice how very awkwardly I was reaching my arm around there? Don't forget you can always move the paper. Do be careful not to lift when it's super wet. I'm just going to slide it because the paper is quite wet. But I do want to move it so that it's more comfortable for me. Again, I want the edges of those petals to look really roughly and loose. I haven't really added any more water to this brush. Like I said, this is a nice thirsty brush. It's one that I'm sending in my paint kits that I'm putting together. So I'm testing it out, making sure that I know how it's going to perform before I put it in those boxes for everybody. These are my front-facing petals, so they're going to be a good deal shorter. So I'm just going to go back and forth and make these look a little bit rounder here at the ends. Like so. Again, I'm imagining that those are facing forward. There. So this is just our first layer, and it's relatively light. It looks pink at this point. We would not want to use white in with our watercolor if we were using traditional methods. Some people do use white with watercolor, and that's okay, but I prefer not to unless I absolutely have to. You know, it's an emergency sort of thing. I feel it dulls the watercolors and doesn't allow their translucent nature to really shine through. They can sparkle like jewels almost if you allow the many different layers and the whiteness of the paper to shimmer through. So that's what we're going to aim for here. We're going to try not to use any white. We're going to use the transparency of the pigments with the white of the paper, and then change how much water we use with each layer to really make the value or the lightness or darkness of our hues change throughout the piece. So this is our first layer. Before that dries, I'm going to go ahead and add a second layer. Now, this second layer is where we're going to start adding some of the depth of the piece. So in this second layer, I'm just going to add a little bit more pigment by brushing in that little cake of color here and then adding that to what I already had. So I didn't add more water to the mixture, I just added a little more pigment. And this throughout the piece is going to be a game of making sure our proportion of water to pigment is what we want it to be. And now in these side petals, so when I say side, I mean these right here. This will be the back of our flower. This is the front coming towards the viewer. And then these are the sides here. These side petals, I'm going to add some of this nice rich red here. Okay. And then here. Starting to dry a little bit. It's okay. I have a trick for that too. Notice where it's very wet, the pigment is flowing into what's already there. And then here where it has dried, it's just sitting there, not really flowing together, especially right there. So I can fix this, but what I was hoping it would do is flow into what was on the bottom layer a little bit more fully. So I'm going to go back and make that flow a little bit more nicely. But before it dries any further, I'm going to add just a touch of black. And I mean, I'm barely going to add a touch of black into this to make it almost imperceptibly darker, and then add that back here on these back petals. I just want it to look like it's slightly farther away, but still nice and rich red. Like that. And then on these petals that are coming forward, our marks are going to be much shorter because these tips of the petals are really facing towards you. So these marks will be quite short, like so. And I'm even going to gently trace under this petal just a touch to sort of make sure we see that that kind of goes over this petal and that this petal goes over that one just a touch. Alright, the next little step will be to add a touch more black, and again this is just the tiniest little tap on the black cake into the rest of your pigment. If you can see me mixing here on the side, I'm going to scoot this into the screen a bit more. So this is the tiniest little tap that I've then mixed in, and we're going to start delineating these petals a little more clearly here. Notice how that blends right in, and that's what we want. We don't want this to stand out at the end very much. And then a few little marks. Notice how very little of the brush is actually moving or touching the paper. I'm showing you to the side here in case you can't see, but when I use my brush, I'm just barely touching. If you find that your lines are too thick or aren't holding the shape that you wish they would, it could be two things, and we'll practice making very, very thin lines in just a moment and talk more about that. For right now, it doesn't quite matter how thick or thin they are, because these don't need to be very detailed. They can be really any thickness, and they will still look quite lovely. This is still in the initial stage of forming the poppy. But this is really enough for right now. I might just make sure that I can see that this petal comes on top of this petal, and that, you know, this petal looks like it's on top of that petal. That there's a little bit of definition, but truly I don't need a whole lot right now. A lot of this is going to come later, and you might decide that you want your poppy to look much looser or much more detailed. That's entirely up to you. It's a personal taste sort of thing. We're also going to add a few little buds in our scene as well. So, and these start as almost like egg shapes. Gonna have one over here. And maybe we'll do one over here, kind of like it's hanging down. One thing we might do is take a scrap piece of paper and practice a little bit before we move on. Let's practice here. We're going to practice. I'm using just the very tip of the brush, and I want to be sure that I'm lifting. And with even a giant brush such as this one, if I'll take good care of the tip of the brush, then it can paint very delicate details for me. The secret to that is really just making sure that I've made the bristles able to align themselves the way that they want to be aligned. So if I'll make sure that it isn't jammed up with paint, or that it hasn't been mashed or pushed or jammed or stabbed or scribbled in some way, then the bristles will want to resume this shape. And if they aren't back in this lovely shape, then all I have to do is wet the brush and then wipe along the edge, and as I dry the brush, I pull and twist, pull and twist, pull and twist, to make sure that I'm getting a nice sharp tip like so. And then when I apply the paint, I just pull through the paint. I don't stab in there. And then I have this lovely little tip that I can, get the finest of details with. So I would take your brush and just practice on the side with some scrap paper. This is just computer paper, and I keep a little bit beside me so that if I am a little stressed, or if I need to breathe before I do something delicate, then I can sort of relax my hand and get to a calm zone where I can get these nice fine lines, because part of it is the brush and part of it is also the amount of pressure that you put on the paper and how you hold your arm, wrist, and fingers. So tension and the way that you hold yourself also has a good deal to do with it. So after you've practiced making fine lines for a little bit, we can come back and start adding onto our piece. Okay, what we're going to do now is start adding more of our black into the poppy. So before the red gets any more dry, we want to go ahead and mix a little bit of black with some water. The main thing we have to keep in mind here is that we cannot mix this with too much water. It has to be fairly well concentrated, or it will make water spots. There is a rule when mixing wet on wet with watercolor that you don't want to add a layer on top of what you already have that's thinner than what's already there. And the reason is that it will cause the layers underneath to start to spread in very unpredictable ways. And watercolor is already quite unpredictable, which in some ways is wonderful and really magical, but we do want to be able to have some things stay where we put them, and so we don't want to make giant puddles form in places that we really don't want them to be. I'm barely brushing this black in the center around this oval, and then I'm going to go around the oval with a fairly solid swipe, like so. And I'm thinking of brushing around the flower like so. I'm lifting the tip of the brush as I go around. Alright. Once you have your details laid in here, then we're going to add a few around the buds as well. Just a few. And inside of the poppy, I'm just going to add a little bit of, well, that's too much. Let's say I have too much water somewhere, it's gotten too wet. There are two options here. I can either very carefully roll up the tip of a paper towel and absorb that, or if I need precision, I can get the paintbrush dry and use the paintbrush, especially a nice thirsty brush, to absorb that water or paint or whatever it is. So I picked up most of the water that was there, but here I'm going to add a little bit of, this is basically dirty water, but I want it to be a very watered down burgundy. So that's the black and the red mixed together. And then I'm going to let that dry and paint some details over it. And while that dries, we'll work on our leaves. The leaves are somewhat like parsley in that they have lots of lacy little bits, or they don't have a very regular shape anyway. And you can use whatever green you have. I'm sort of mixing a couple of greens. I've got a deep foresty green and a bright green, and I don't really want it to be either one of those. So I'm just sort of mixing those together, but you can make it any sort of green you have. And what we'll do is begin with our brushes not very wet with paint. So I'm mixing my color together, and then what I would advise you to do after you've gotten your green to whatever shade you think looks nice is to wipe off any excess paint. You could even wipe it off on your paper towel, and then only run the bottom fourth or so of the bristles back through the paint so that they aren't too wet. Again, watercolor is about controlling how wet the brush is and how much pigment and paint you're using. So now let's start here at the petals and very, very gently and smoothly breathing. Just make a nice simple line. When I say to breathe there, it's important that you not tense up too much and just make your line as smooth as you can. It doesn't matter exactly where it goes, because we can pretend that the wind has blown it any which way that you'd like, but it will look very strange indeed if you stutter with your line. So if you hesitate too much, it's going to look quite strange. So instead, be confident and make your line go any which way you want, but keep it smooth and steady. Breathe and make it nice and continuous, whichever direction you would like for it to go. And then from this smooth and steady line, we're going to pull up another smooth and steady line for the leaf, which we'll let curve outward like that. And from here, we are going to make a series of marks. For this part, I do want to get my brush actually quite wet. So I'm going to add a little bit of water to this green here. I need this to flow a little bit more than it is. Okay. These marks are going to go out and away from the line that we just made. So this is our central line of the leaf, and then we're going to have some lines that point out and away, up and then out and down. So here's what I mean. This line will go up, up, and they're going to be all different lengths so that they don't look too regular. Like so. And then going the opposite way, again, remember, you can move the paper. I always forget that for some reason, and then I feel so silly when I've contorted myself into some odd shape to try and be comfortable when I could have just moved the paper. So, move the paper when you need to. And there we are. And then you can go and reshape any edges that look kind of funny. Look, I think that looks a bit too lacy there. So I'll go and smooth that out a bit. Okay. That'll do. And then I'm going to make another leaf on this side in the same way. So I'll start with a central line here and then make some little lines that sort of go out from it. Oh, see, if you just don't think about it too much, it usually turns out way better. I think I was thinking a little bit too hard about the other one and it looked a bit funny. But this one, where I'm just sort of being a little bit more random with it, it actually looks way better. And that's usually the way of things with watercolor. If you're trying too hard, it usually looks a bit strange. So there's a couple of leaves here, and then what I'm going to do is start to bring these buds down with a little connection here. And they'll have their own stems coming down, 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 and maybe a little leaf here. And we could do a little leaf down here. I'm sort of just adding leaves wherever I think it needs it. So if you're looking at mine and thinking, oh, she added one here and she added one there, I'm really just adding it wherever it looks a little empty. So if your piece doesn't need one there, then don't add one there. Mine just needed one, and I think right here on my piece is a bit empty looking. So I'm either going to add a leaf or, oh, no, I know, let's add another green bud. That'll look pretty. So in some places, I might add a bud that's all green still. Hasn't opened at all. And that might go here, and then cross back down and through. Maybe there's another one. 1, 2, 3. The little leaf here. Kind of covering up my boo-boo there. Did you see it? I think I dropped a little paint. Not sure when that happened, but oh well. Don't know what I was thinking there. Well, I'm gonna pretend that didn't happen. Now, let's go ahead and let's add a little bit more down here, and then we'll finish up our big poppy. I think we need a few more little buds down here, and then we'll pretty much have it done. Kind of pretending that this leaf is very, very close to the viewer. Almost right in front of our noses, so to speak. As if you're looking through the scene. See that? Oh. So once you've placed your buds and your leaves wherever you think it makes sense, then we can add a little hint of detail to these by adding a darker shade of green or even brown. I think I'm going to use some brown and mix it in with the green because that'll look nice. So I've got my green and my brown, and I'm going to mix those two together here. And I don't think that my green is still wet in most places, so I don't want to make it too much darker than what I've already got, because it is going to stand out on top of what's already there. It's not going to blend in when I put it down right away. So what I'll do is I'll place it here in the center, like so, and then coming up a little bit, like that. And I'll go around these little buds in a U shape, and up, up, up. Don't guess I finished that stem. All I'm doing is kind of tracing along the edge of these to add a little bit more dimension there. And what I'll do now is use a damp brush, so I'm gonna rinse it and then get it almost completely dry, so I've gotten as much of the moisture out as I possibly can. And then I'm going to go back to those lines and just brush right over them and beyond them to blend them out a little bit. I'm not adding any paint, nor am I trying to push very hard. I'm just very gently brushing over those marks a little bit to blend them out. I wouldn't try to do that on these very thin lines here, only on the bigger marks on the leaves. Maybe on the buds. And that is going to leave it with a variety of tones in the leaves there. I think that we're ready to add the details in the middle. So, for the very middle, I'm thinking of the stamen and the very, very middle where little bees and other insects would collect their pollen. And so I want to use just the very, very, very tip of the brush, and I have a moistened brush, but it isn't very wet, it's just damp, and I've rubbed it against the black to just pick up a little bit of the black pigment. But it isn't very wet again, it's just a little bit of that black pigment. I don't want it to be sticky though, so it does flow, and you can kind of see here, it's not sticky, but it's also not very wet. It kind of comes right back together. So with that, I'm then going to add some little dots here. Almost in that oval shape. And then another tiny row inside of there. And then there's a row of these little hair-like things. The little filaments there. And I wouldn't try to do every single one. I would just try to add some in there and then kind of stop when it looks full. And I would add a little hint up here. Dots. And then kind of stop once you think it's nice and full. And you've got the idea of a poppy here. I hope that you have enjoyed painting with me today. I would like to continue this series and add a little tutorial every now and then. I enjoy painting with my children, and I hope that you enjoy painting as a way to relax, as a way to be mindful of the things that our heart ought to remember and ought to contemplate and take in. And I hope you'll take a moment to pause and live in the moment more and enjoy slowing down and painting or listening to poetry or good music. And I have some suggestions of stories that my children and I have enjoyed relating to Memorial Day and Poppies, and poems that we love, and a song that has stayed with me for well over 30 years that is just so hauntingly beautiful, that I hope you'll check out. And again, thank you so very much. I would appreciate it if you would follow me. I have just launched my YouTube channel a few days ago. It's brand new, and this is my first video, so please be kind, and and I'll hopefully get better with editing my videos and the setup and everything. But thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate everything, and I hope that you have gotten something out of this. Take care. Bye-bye.